For most of aviation history, progress has been easy to recognize. It arrives loudly, announced by speed records, larger airframes, or dramatic changes that the world immediately understands. But every so often, progress arrives quietly, wrapped in ideas so unfamiliar that they are mistaken not for the future, but for a mistake. The aircraft at the center of this story was one of those arrivals. When it first appeared, it did not look like a gamble or an experiment. It looked complete, confident, certain of its place in the sky. And yet, from the moment it emerged, it existed out of sync with the world around it, as if it had crossed an invisible boundary between decades and arrived far earlier than anyone had planned. At the time of its introduction, aviation was governed by deeply ingrained assumptions. Aircraft were expected to behave in familiar ways. Pilots were expected to maintain constant authority over machines that demanded attention and input. Airlines were structured around predictable systems that had evolved slowly, cautiously, and incrementally. Innovation was welcomed only when it fit neatly into what already existed. Anything that asked the industry to rethink itself was quietly resisted, no matter how elegant the solution appeared on paper. This aircraft challenged those assumptions not through spectacle, but through philosophy. It was not designed to impress at air shows or dominate headlines. It was designed to function differently, to reduce human burden rather than glorify human control, to anticipate a future in which aviation would be shaped by intelligent systems working in harmony with people instead of constantly relying on them. That idea alone placed it years ahead of its surroundings. From its earliest conceptual stages, the aircraft was built around the belief that the limits of aviation were no longer defined by raw performance, but by how much responsibility could be shifted away from fallible humans and into systems designed to operate without fatigue, emotion, or hesitation. This was a subtle but radical departure from the thinking of the era. It suggested that safety did not come from tighter grip, but from trust, and trust in aviation is never given easily. When the aircraft finally took shape, it embodied this philosophy in ways that were immediately noticeable to those who understood what they were seeing. Its systems were deeply integrated rather than layered on top of older designs. Its behavior in flight was calm, stable, and deliberate. Instead of demanding constant correction, it offered consistency. Instead of overwhelming crews with raw data, it processed information quietly in the background. It was not trying to replace pilots, but it was clearly preparing for this approach created a strange contradiction. On one hand, the aircraft performed exactly as promised. It met its targets. It behaved predictably. It demonstrated a level of refinement that suggested maturity rather than experimentation. On the other hand, the very smoothness of its operation unsettled those who expected aircraft to feel mechanical, demanding, and visibly labor-intensive. The absence of struggle was interpreted not as progress, but as loss of control. In the broader aviation landscape, this aircraft stood alone. Its peers were products of compromise, designed to fit into existing infrastructure with minimal disruption. This aircraft, by contrast, assumed that infrastructure itself would eventually evolve. It assumed that training would adapt, that procedures would change, and that the industry would move forward rather than protect itself from discomfort. In doing so, it exposed a gap between what was technically possible and what was culturally acceptable. Early observers struggled to categorize it. It did not fail in obvious ways. It did not succeed in dramatic ones either. Instead, it quietly revealed how unprepared the world was for what it represented. Airlines looked at it and saw not just an aircraft, but a list of questions they were not ready to answer. Pilots looked at it and sensed a future in which their role would change, even if their importance would not diminish. Regulators looked at it and realized it did not fit neatly into existing frameworks. None of these reactions were rooted in fear of danger. They were rooted in fear of change. The aircraft had arrived with answers to problems that most of the industry had not yet admitted existed. It addressed efficiency before fuel crises forced the issue. It emphasized automation before workload became a recognized risk. It treated information management as a core safety feature long before data overload became an acknowledged threat. In every meaningful way, it was speaking to a future that had not yet begun. This misalignment defined its earliest days. While it operated flawlessly within its own design logic, it remained misunderstood by the environment it entered. It was not rejected outright. Instead, it was viewed. Time for the industry to catch up. Time for mindsets to shift. Time for the world to experience the problems this aircraft was already designed to solve. But aviation does not pause for the future. It moves according to present comfort. And so this aircraft, complete and confident, found itself waiting in an era that could not yet see what it was meant to become. The distance between innovation and acceptance is rarely measured in years alone. It is measured in mindset, habit, and fear of losing control. As this aircraft entered service, that distance became increasingly visible. Those who encountered it for the first time sensed immediately that it did not belong fully to the present. It behaved as if it expected more from its environment than the environment was prepared to give. It assumed a level of trust between human and machine that aviation had not yet learned to practice, and that assumption shaped every interaction surrounding it. In operational terms, the aircraft did exactly what it was designed to do. It reduced workload not by removing responsibility, but by redistributing it. Tasks that once required constant attention were handled quietly, consistently, and without complaint. The aircraft did not tire, did not rush, did not grow complacent. It simply performed. Yet this very reliability created unease. Pilots trained in an era where vigilance was equated with continuous manual input found themselves supervising rather than commanding. The role had shifted subtly, and subtle shifts are often the hardest to accept. This aircraft suggested that mastery of flight was no longer defined by physical interaction alone, but by understanding systems, anticipating behavior, and trusting processes that could outperform human reflexes under pressure. That idea challenged a deeply rooted professional identity. For generations, pilots had been celebrated as active controllers of complex machines. Here was an aircraft implying that the safest pilot might sometimes be the one who intervened less, not more. The airlines, too, sensed the magnitude of what was being asked of them. Adopting this aircraft meant more than adding a new type to the fleet. It meant rethinking training philosophies, maintenance logic, and operational assumptions that had been stable for decades. It meant acknowledging that future efficiency and safety might depend on embracing complexity rather than avoiding it. The aircraft did not force these changes aggressively. It did not demand immediate transformation. Instead, it revealed what transformation would eventually look like, and in doing so, it exposed the gap between current capability and future necessity. That gap was not technical, it was psychological. Observers often misinterpret such moments in aviation history as failures of marketing or timing alone. In reality, they are failures of alignment. Technology can move faster than culture. Engineering can solve problems before society admits they exist. When that happens, the result is not rejection, but hesitation. This aircraft became a mirror, reflecting the limits of its era. It showed how deeply aviation relied on established habits. It revealed how comfort could outweigh curiosity, even in an industry defined by risk management. And it demonstrated that being correct too early can be just as limiting as being wrong. What made this period particularly striking was the absence of catastrophe. There was no dramatic moment when the aircraft was declared unsafe or unworkable. It did not fail publicly. Instead, it succeeded privately, day after day, flight after flight, proving its concepts while remaining misunderstood. Inside cockpits, the change was quiet but profound. Crews learned that the aircraft rewarded understanding over force. It responded best not to aggressive correction, but to thoughtful supervision. In maintenance hangars, a similar shift unfolded. Diagnostics replaced guesswork. Data began to matter as much as physical inspection. Problems could be identified before they manifested. This predictive approach hinted at a future where reliability would be engineered rather than enforced. None of these challenges indicated a flaw in the aircraft. They indicated a mismatch between capability and readiness. The machine had stepped forward. The world hesitated. This hesitation shaped how the aircraft was perceived beyond technical circles. Instead of being celebrated as a vision of what aviation could become, it was quietly labeled as demanding, complex, and unconventional. These labels did not arise from failure, but from unfamiliarity. They served as shorthand for discomfort. The irony is that the aircraft never claimed to be easy. It claimed to be better. And in industries under pressure, better is often postponed in favor of acceptable. The aircraft's ideas required patience, investment, and trust. As time passed, this dynamic hardened. The aircraft continued to operate, continued to prove itself, continued to demonstrate that its philosophy was sound. But proof alone could not accelerate acceptance. The surrounding world needed to change first. Until then, the aircraft existed in a kind of temporal isolation. It belonged to a future that had not yet arrived, operating within a present that did not fully understand it. This isolation defined its early life. Acceptance rarely arrives all at once. It creeps in quietly, disguised as necessity. But during the earliest phase of this aircraft's life, necessity had not yet revealed its hand. The world still believed it could afford caution. What made this moment uniquely fragile was that the aircraft did not offer obvious compromises. Its design was coherent from end to end, built around assumptions that could not be selectively ignored without losing their value. It was an all-or-nothing proposition. Those responsible for evaluating it often found themselves conflicted. On paper, its logic was difficult to argue against. In practice, it required trust in systems that had not yet earned emotional legitimacy. The narrative that formed around the aircraft did not say it was wrong. It said it was ahead. And being ahead, in a conservative industry, is rarely an advantage. The aircraft occupied a space between admiration and avoidance. As it continued to fly, it quietly demonstrated what the future could look like. Flights were smoother, workload was lower, systems behaved predictably, but reliability rarely makes headlines. The absence of drama worked against it. In an environment where acceptance often follows crisis, the aircraft offered calm instead. And so it waited, operating politely.